All right, so obviously this board has to not only set renewal lease adjustments for apartments, buildings, but also for hotels and lofts. So we do a price index that's just for hotels and one that's just for lofts. So the price index for all stabilized hotels rose 6.4% this year, a lower increase than the 7.4% rise in 2013. The price index for hotels was 0.7% higher than the increase in costs measured in the apartment index. This is due to disparities between the hotel index and the apartment index in the utilities and tax components. The increase in utilities for all types of hotels was 13% versus the 8.4% rise for apartment buildings. Furthermore, taxes for hotels increased at a higher pace, 6.4%, than the increase for apartments, which was 5.5%. As I mentioned already, utilities rose by the greatest portion in 2013, followed by insurance costs, which rose 9.3%, but account for only 3.7% of the costs in hotels. Fuel oil costs, which make up 18% of the PIC for hotels, also rose significantly, rising 7.8%. More moderate increases were seen in the remaining components. Labor increased 3.6%, contractor services by 3.3%, administrative costs rose 2.4%, parts and supplies and replacement costs, which carry very little weight in the hotel index, rose 1.5% and 2.8% respectively. We can also break it out by hotel type. So there's basically 3 different types of hotels that this board is responsible for setting renewal lease adjustments for. Hotels, which are generally Class A, Class B hotels, that increase was 6.8%. Rooming houses increase of 6.1%, and SROs, the price index for SROs was 6.3%.
Andrew, what's the difference between a rooming house and an SRO?
There's a description in the report. Let's see. Yeah, on page 9, rooming houses is a multiple dwelling other than a hotel with 30 or fewer sleeping rooms. And single-room occupancy hotels, a multiple dwelling in which 1 or 2 persons reside separately and independently of other occupants in a single room. There's probably more of a definition there that we don't cover. We could try to get specific. I think
They're
it's.
all
I'm pretty
aggregated.
sure it's discussed in the explanatory statement for hotels. If you want, we could take a look at it there if you want.
Follow up.
There's more of a distinction what's going on.
Andrew, just as we said in the rent stabilized context, at hotel, these are the aggregate costs for the hotel itself, even if there's only one SRO unit.
Correct.
So the fuel cost could be up because it's operating as a hotel, or utility cost could be because there's a lot of activity, but the SRO unit could be a small portion of that.
Small portion of that.
I mean, there could be 100 units and have 2 SRO units, right?
Yeah, that's true. But look, these are only increases for those rooms,
These are increases,
for those hotel rooms that are identified as stabilized.
but it's for the
So-
building, you're doing the cost
The
for the
building,
building.
right. So whatever happens in the rest of the building is not necessarily reflective. Well, it would be reflected in this price, it would be reflected in the price index, right?
Right.
But we're just setting increases on those units that are
Right,
stabilized.
but the price index here, if we're talking
Yeah.
about the entire
Yep.
building.
Correct.
And just to note, particularly as it relates to hotels, that is all owner expense, not any tenant expense. So whether that be an SRO tenant or a non-SRO tenant, the consumption or the cost to the owner they're indifferent if that unit is occupied. Meaning there's no difference to the owner whether it's an SRO tenant occupying it or a non-SRO tenant occupying a unit, because in the cases of hotels, there's not a single cost borne by the tenant. It's all owner.
Except what they pay monthly, right? So a tenant who's an SRO tenant pays a weekly charge versus a hotel occupant pays nightly a different amount. So a hotel that has 100 units and 95 of them are hotel units and 5 are SRO units. The SRO tenants are paying their weekly charge, and the hotel then operates the other 95 units like a hotel. People come in and out every day, and they pay the nightly charge. So
But that doesn't have anything to do with the operating expenses of that particular unit. That's
it's the income on the income side.
right, the income side. But the operating expenses for hotels are the most pronounced, that there's no sharing. You're not culpable or responsible for operating expenses. But yes, on the rent side, it has a different duration than it would be if you're SRO or a nightly tenant. But from an operating expense standpoint, it should be a push.
I think, Harvey, obviously the questions you're raising are extraordinarily important for the sort of the big picture, but I think just for understanding the PIOC, because the focus is all on expense, it makes sense to kind of narrow the discussion to get through the report.
Andrew, I have a question about the 3 categories of hotels. What is the predominant category?
That's a good question. I think rooming houses and SROs, I don't know which one wins. Probably SROs unit-wise is my guess, and then rooming houses. Class A and Class B hotels, there's not as many units that are stabilized in those, certainly. My guess, and we could get this for you, is probably SRO and then rooming house. We could do it, break it out. And I think we've done that in past memos, which we'll try to do again, hotel memo, to take a look at. We take a look at what's registered by owners to DHCR, and we sort of take a look at rents on that side and what's going on. All right, so next is lofts. The increase in the loft index this year was 5.7%, the same increase seen in apartments. Although the increases in the components of these indices were similar, there were disparities in the importance, again going back to the idea of weighting, that the components hold in each index. Insurance costs rose 9.3 in both indices, but this is a rise in costs carried more weight in the loft index, making up 17% of this index versus 7% for the apartment. Counterbalancing the upward pressure of the insurance costs and loft index, the smaller increase in utilities of 7.2% for lofts versus 8.4% for apartments put a downward pressure on the loft index. The disparities in the weights for the components that make up these 2 indices resulted in a loft index that happened to be similar to the price index for apartments. We also do something called the core price index, which excludes the erratic changes in fuel oil, natural gas, and electricity costs. And the core rose 4.7% this year. The core probably goes back about 20, 25 years. So we track that. We're trying to take out the heating expense portion of it. As this graph illustrates, over the period from 1990 to 2004, the changes in the core PIOC, the orange line, were generally less dramatic compared to changes in the price index that are represented, again, in that green line. However, since 2005, the percentage point changes in the core from year to year have been more in line with the price index. And what's happening is there's other components that have become volatile in the price index, particularly insurance and taxes, that have now sort of made the core bump all over the place as well. And that's what's happening here. The rise in the 2014 core was 1 percentage point lower than the apartment index, and that was due to the rise of fuel oil costs of 7.8%, and the gas heating costs rising 17% are not included as part of that core. So that's why it was lower this year. So this is the projection. This slide shows an overview of the price index projections from March of 2014 to March of 2015. Projections for the components of the price index are performed to provide the rent connoisseur with an estimate of how much costs are expected to rise in the year following the current price index. The projection is used in the traditional commensurate formula only. It is also important to note that changes in costs and prices after March 2014 The last month covered by this study will be measured in next year's price index. Overall, the PIOC is expected to grow by 0.7% from 2014 to 2015. Costs are predicted to rise in each component except fuel oil, where costs are anticipated to decline 8.6%. The largest growth of 6.3% is projected to be in the insurance cost component. More moderate increases are projected in utilities of 4.9%, labor 3%, administrative costs 2.5%, and contractor services 3.5%. Taxes, the component that carries the most weight in the index, is projected to increase 2.5%. The parts and supplies and replacement costs components are expected to rise 2.2% and 2% respectively. The core PIOC is projected to rise 3.2% more than the overall projected apartment PIOC.
Andrew, sorry, again, I know we got to get through this, but I just, how the projections are done, it's based on an extrapolation from historical going forward?
Some of them are, but others are, for example, taxes, we use the tentative assessment roll and what tax rates are predicted to do. And the tentative in recent years has been different than what the final has, and that's why our projection has been a little wrong. Utilities, water and sewer rates. We know what the rate is now. And actually it's included in the report in your folder. That is the correct increase now. So we factored in that 3.35% increase. So that's changed from the report earlier. So that we know is going to happen. Other items we try to predict, we take what, I think it's the Federal Agency Energy, I forgot, I'm sorry, I forgot, but they predict oil prices and gas prices. Okay. And then we assume going back to normal weather. So that's what we do with the fuel costs. So there's certain things where we just, like the insurance, will just take an average over a certain amount of time, and same thing. Labor costs, if it's a union, if we have the contract, we know what the union labor increases are going to be. We're not sure always what's going to happen with some of the other stuff, so we have to do averages there. So some of it is pretty solid, and some of it is guesswork.
Andrews, with regards to the fuel, negative 8.6, does that mean we're projecting a colder year?
No, going back to a normal year. So this year was colder than a normal year. So we're assuming, okay, normal weather, because the normal weather is what's been for the last, it's from normal is 1980 to 2010. So those are the averages. So we're saying, okay, if we have normal weather, it's going to go back to a warmer year. And I'd have to go back and look, but I would imagine that's why it ended up being a negative number. It was probably not the price so much as assuming a normal weather year. And I am not God, so I say that will happen. But this projection, as we go forward, we're going to go talk about the commensurates. By law, we're supposed to do a projected cost. We only use it in one formula. It's a traditional commensurate. So although it's an important part of the price index, you have to sort of put it in perspective, the projection, how it impacts, making guidelines and things like that. It's not the end-all, be-all. So,
sorry, Andrew, one more time. In that chart, though, when you normalize for for fuel in your core PIOC, you do have a projection for 2015, and so your core is actually
a bit higher.
Yeah, it's 3.5% versus the 1.7.
Right, because we're saying.
Right, you're normalizing for the
the
fuel. Okay.
So, I'm going to discuss commensurate rent adjustments. So each year, the board is obligated to formulate guidelines, and the law only gives very general criteria, i.e. the board considers mortgage finance, income and expense data, tenant income and housing affordability, the price index, and other factors in setting the guidelines. Just one tool the board has used since its inception is called the commensurate rent adjustment. What the commensurate rent adjustment determines is how much would rents have to change to keep the owner of rent-stabilized buildings whole. In other words, if you want to maintain the net operating income, and which say it was $40, and the income on that building was $100, how much would rents have to change to keep the NOI at $40 in absolute fixed dollars? How much would rents have to be adjusted to keep that NOI figure constant, or at the same number? The first commensurate method is called the net revenue approach. While this formula takes into consideration the types of leases actually signed by tenants, it does not adjust landlords' NOI for inflation. The net revenue formula is presented in two ways. First, adjusting for the mix of lease terms, and second, adding an assumption for stabilized apartment turnover and the impact of revenue from vacancy increases. So under the net revenue formula, a guideline that would preserve NOI in the face of this year's 5.7% increase in the price index would be 4.75% for a one-year lease, excuse me, and an 8.5% for a two-year lease. Using this formula, adding assumptions for the impact of vacancy increases on revenues when apartments experience turnover, result in guidelines of 3% for one-year leases and 5.75% for two-year leases. The commensurate formula, including a vacancy assumption, 8.33% median increase in vacancy leases that was found in the rent-stabilized apartments that reported a vacancy lease in the 2012 apartment registration file from the DHCR was used. So that's the net revenue formula. CPI adjusted formula is the second type of commensurate method that we use, and it considers the mix of lease terms while adjusting NOI upward to reflect general inflation, keeping both O&M costs and NOI constant. This is commonly called, or we call it anyway, the CPI adjusted NOI formula. So a guideline that would preserve NOI in the face of a 1.5% increase in the CPI and the 5.7% increase in the price index is 5.5% for a one-year lease and 9.5% for a two-year lease. Guidelines using this formula and adding in the estimated impact of vacancy increases are 3.75% for one-year leases and 6.75% for two-year leases. And using the traditional formula, which has been around since 1969 and the inception of the board, it's the only one that uses the projection. And this yields a 3.8% for a one-year lease and 4.3% for a two-year lease. And once again, it reflects the increase of the operating costs of 5.7 found in the price index and the projection of 1.7% for next year. But it does not take into account the mix of lease terms or inflation into account. And about 60% of folks sign leases every year. So when we're talking about mixed-term leases, that's what we're referring to. So the idea of the commensurates outside the traditional, that uses the projection, but basically the other one is saying if you're renewing a lease, you're going to cover for the expense in the price index. So those lease signers are making the owner whole when you consider those other two formulas. Where the projection tries to project out for people who are signing.
This is probably an elementary question, but do I understand this correctly? The commensurate rent adjustment, regardless of which formula you look at, but just the sort of the definition of the commensurate rent adjustment, the goal, if I understand this, was to keep the NOI on absolute dollars the same.
Correct. From what it was the previous year.
Okay. So if that is the NOI on an absolute basis the same, that in itself is not CPI adjusted. or
It is in that CPI adjusted
i-
formula. Right.
in that particular
Right,
formula?
right, right. And
But-
that's why in staff in the 90s did these other commensurates, because the first one doesn't account for mixed term of leases, so we did that one, the net revenue formula. And then the other realization was that we weren't keeping the NOI whole for inflation, so that's what
Right.
that one's doing.
Okay, and that's why we got the CPI
Mhm.
adjusted, because it would be interesting if without these other formulas to look at, you would have a flat line NOI from inception. I could see why they would want a CPI adjustment, because otherwise you would, when you're dealing with absolute dollars, you would actually have a negative increase when you don't adjust for real inflation. Okay, so now I understand, and that's the purpose of the CPI adjusted NOI, but no other formula takes into account the CPI.
Correct,
Thank you.
correct.
Can I ask a question about the other piece of the vacancy? What factors, are you just using a vacancy increase, or are you doing?
No,
when a
we're doing
vacancy
what the
happens,
median increase was for apartments registered with the DHCR in 2012,
Yeah.
and that was 8.33%.
So the vacancy,
But if you put the vacancy allowance of 20% in there, it would change.
that's what you put in for the?
No, just the median increase, which
So
was
it's just the 8%?
8.33%.
Not the
right.
20%?
Not the 20%.
And not potentially more of an owner could do
Correct.
140?
That's not in there.
So those factors aren't calculated in that?
Right, what we're saying is of those owners who registered, their median increase upon vacancy was 8.33%. And that's the number we use.
So Andrew, Sarah was concerned that without a CPI increase, that keeping the NOI flat would obviously lead to, in real dollars, decline for landlords. Can you tell us what actually has happened as a result of the, say in the last decade, of the various decisions of the RGB in terms of the NOI of the landlords and
That's the
realtors?
next report, if we get to that this morning.
Let's try, 'cause that's obviously useful.
That tracks NOI from year to year, and, I think is a better question addressed
Right.
for Brian. Is Brian still here, Brian? So,
Andrew, are you going to address the memo on the I&E adjusted?
it's right there.
There you go.
All right. Thank you, perfect timing, David. Did you plan that? So, every PISC in the last 30 years, including the most recent index, is based on expenditure patterns of owners from 1983. Although these expenditure weights are revised each year, and there have been some changes to the expenditure items since 1983, I think we talked earlier about where we went back and looked at the distribution of gas heated and oil heated. That was one of those changes. The price index may no longer represent expenditure patterns that are prevalent today. In fact, the RGB report that measures recent owner-reported expenses, in the income and expense study, shows that increases in overall operating costs have been smaller than those shown by PISCs in recent years. In the fall of 2013, the RGB commissioned Dr. James Hudson to study this issue, and he presented his findings at the board's meeting on March 27th. Dr. Hudson concluded that the main cause of the differences between the PISC and the I&E is how owners change their spending in response to changes in prices in the goods and services that are available. And these changes are not captured in the price index. In an attempt to update the PISC to reflect current expenditure patterns, Dr. Hudson, along with the assistance from the RGB staff, used the expenditure patterns presented in the 2014 income and expense study to update the component weights for the 2014 PIOC. In addition, a historical analysis was conducted to gauge the impact of using the I&E component weights in PIOCs dating back to 1999. Data used to update the component weights for this 2014 PIOC is contained in is in the 2014 income and expense study. And the I&Es use uses summary data from the New York Department of Finance, the Real Property Income and Expense Filings, or RPIEs, to report on owner expense. So data from the 2013 RPI filings were used and represent owner-reported expenses from calendar year 2012. In order to update the PIOC component weights, so there were two technical, issues involved in using the I&E weights that had to be addressed. So first, the individual items in the price index needed to be allocated to the corresponding I&E components. The current PIOC contains 9 components, and the I&E data is categorized into 8 components. So using the expense categories chart from the 2013 RPI worksheet, we were able to take PIOC expense items and allocate them to the corresponding I&E expense categories. So, for example, the fuel component in the I&E includes natural gas costs, fuel oil, and steam. Therefore, the gas and steam heating items from the price PIOC utilities component, as well as the fuel oil component items, were put into one component labeled fuel. This same procedure was used with other PIOC items and in I&E expense components. There were a few items that did not fit into any of the I&E expense categories, such as the PIOC items that priced out air conditioners, so they were not included in this update. But these items carry minimal weight in the PIOC, so the effect of not including them was negligible. Furthermore, there were no items priced in the PIOC that fit into the I&E expense category of miscellaneous, so that component is not included in this analysis. Therefore, 7 components are used in the I&E weight-based 2014 PIOC. Second, the I&E weights are from 1 year earlier than the PIOC, so those data needed to be updated based on the previous PIOC prices. And this is sort of the methodology that it is the methodology that we use every year in the price index. So, for example, in the 2014, we had to take the I&E cost components from 2012. We updated these estimated 2013 costs based on the 2013 PIOC and adjust the weights based on those costs, which is something we do. Like, we take the prices from one PIOC year and the weights, and then we come up with new weights. So that's essentially what we did. The only difference is our starting point is not the price index component weights, we're starting with the I&E component weights. After applying the methodology outlined above, the impact of using I&E component weights with the 2014 PIOC price relatives result in lowering the price index for apartments from 5.7 to 5.2%. This slide compares the component weights in each index. In this table, note that the weight of the I&E fuel component, which includes oil and natural gas, is similar to the weight in the PIOC for fuel oil alone. The I&E-based approach also shows insurance as a smaller portion of the expenditures and administration as a larger one compared to the 2014 PIOC. It is important to note that this new methodology still uses the same prices and costs as reported in the 2014 PIOC. Therefore, the individual price relatives do not change from one to the other. Real estate taxes increased 5% in the 2014 PIOC. The same increase is used in the 2014 I&E-based PIOC. What differs is the importance of these changes in price from one index to the other. So taxes represent 20.7% in the 2014 price index and 26.6% of the 2014 I&E-based PIOC. So the price and costs relatives remain the same. Again, it's just the importance that they take on. So since 1983, as we talked about earlier, the price index has calculated separate indices for different types of buildings that contain rent-stabilized units. So in addition to the all-apartment PIOC, separate indices for buildings constructed before 1947, buildings post-1946, gas-heated buildings and oil-heated buildings can also be calculated using the I&E component weights. So this table compares these separate indices using the 2014 PIOC and the 2014 I&E-based PIOC. So for example, in the price index this year. Pre-47 index was 6.2. In the I&E based, it was 5.2. Gas heated was very similar. It was 6.2% and 6%.
Slide, I have a question about the universe of buildings.
Okay.
The PIAC, the plain PIAC column, does include smaller buildings. Is that correct?
Correct.
In other words, buildings with less than 11 units.
Mhm.
But does the I&E based PIAC include those? Because the I&E information does not include smaller buildings.
It doesn't, yeah, the information we use to update this does not include the smaller buildings, correct.
So the universe of buildings is actually slightly different in these two.
It is different, yeah. So now that this methodology is in place to update the PIOC expenditure weights using I&E data, we can go review previous apartment PIOC indices, comparing these new I&E-based PIOCs with traditional methodology. As this table illustrates, there are years in which the I&E-based changes exceed expense growth of the PIOC, and other years where the PIOC grew faster. This comes from the differences in weights. We keep going back to that, don't we? For example, the 2014 I&E-based PIOC had a lower weight for fuel oil items, which again represent basically three different types of fuel oil, 2, 4, and 6, than the PIOC, and that pattern shows up in other years. So in years when fuel oil increased faster than the overall PIOC, an I&E-based approach would typically show a lower increase. In years where fuel oil increased slower than the overall PIOC, an I&E-based approach would tend to be higher. Differences in weights for insurance, administration, and other areas will tend to lower or raise the I&E-based increase compared to the price index. Perhaps the more useful analysis is to examine the growth and expense from the I&E with both the PIOC and I&E-based PIOC over time. In order to do this an analysis, we first needed to adjust the PIOC time frame to that of the I&E. The PIOC tracks price data from March to March, while the RPIE data is based on a calendar year. So once this adjustment was made, the annualized growth rate for these three indices was computed, meaning what was the average each year over time. So from 1999 to 2012, the PIOC witnessed an annualized growth rate of 6.1%. The I&E-based PIOC annualized growth was less at 5.4%, and more in line with that of the RPI expense growth of 5.2%. So to sum up the price index, the price index of operating costs for rent-stabilized buildings rose 5.7% this year. Costs in gas-heated buildings rose 6.2%, while costs in oil-heated buildings increased 5.6%. The core rose by 4.7% this year. Fuel oil costs increased 7.8%. Taxes rose 5% mostly due to a rise in assessment, actually all due to a rise in assessments. Labor costs rose 3%. Utilities component increased by 8.4%. Insurance costs increased by 9.3%. The price index of operating costs for rent-stabilized apartment buildings is projected to increase 1.7% next year. The 2014 I&E-based PIOC was 5.2% lower than the 2014 PIOC, which was 5.2% lower than the 2014 PIOC of 5.7%. And the annualized growth rate of the I&E-based PIOC of 5.4% was closer to that of the I&E longitudinal expense change of 5.2% than that of the PIOC, which the annualized growth rate was 6.1%. And I am done.
Thank you so much, Andrew.
Sure.
Why don't we take a quick break and meet back at 11:15 for Brian's report?